Okay.
All right. So welcome to the Mill Museum of the Galen Historical Society. The society was formed in 1976 as part of the American bicentennial year. And thanks to the generosity of George Ketchum, the mill, which he had closed down in 1973, was donated to the society. And now today we're going to take you around the mill and see how it worked to the best of our knowledge. Okay, we're going to go first of all to the scale. The scale was used mainly to weigh loads of coal, which were being taken out to various neighborhoods. Back in the day, when people heated mainly with coal, it was something that was often delivered in the fall for winter consumption in people's furnaces. In this way, when you weighed the coal, you'd find out how much you should be paying for it. Okay, well, we're going to move around the back of the building first.
And before we talk about the building that is currently here, we have to talk about some of the buildings that are no longer here. So right here where this white door, this entrance into the basement of the mill, was connected to a long, low building here that I've heard called the feed truck building. And what was most relevant for this building here was there was a conveyor belt in this long building where trucks carrying corn that was dried on the cob, they could dump it on here into a conveyor belt and it would be conveyed into a sheller, which we will see in the basement of the mill.
And Benedict, you said that it was once had chickens in this building that was back here?
Yes, and I've also heard that the Ketchums raised fryer chickens in this part of the mill as well, as kind of a side hustle for the business.
Okay.
And over here, you can see right here, Hugh, the remnants of what once was the coal trestle, the coal building. When this operation started in about 1909, Burke and Malloy, and then 1 year later, Ketchum and Malloy, coal was the primary business. So this building would have been connected to a railroad tie. The railroad is there, but there would have been a siding, and a car carrying coal could have backed it in and dumped it down into the building that was there, and then it would have been delivered on trucks. The truck would have come out of here and stopped in on the scale that you showed us just a minute ago. Do you want to mention the creamery?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we see a building now being used as a residence, but it was once a creamery. And at one point, Clyde was a major producer of butter for a good part of New York State. And it was one of two creameries. And their peak of operation was about the same time that the Ketchum and Malloy Mill had started its operation. And so it was interesting that farmer production shifted somewhat from grain to the production of milk and cream. Well, the deck that we see here would have been used by farmers who were bringing in their grain, and they had wanted it ground into various types of cracked corn or even a finer mixture. And so the farmer could pull up, he could unload his corn, he could wait for it to be ground, and then he would be able to pick it up and drive away with it.
Mm-hmm. And they could have brought crates or bags of oats or wheat or barley or other things to be ground, things that couldn't have gone in through that back part where we saw the conveyor would have taken it down to the sheller. So you get a little peek in here into where they would have, set their crates or whatever, or picked it back up.
And I would like to make the point that not only did we have a railroad siding coming up to the south of the building, to the north of the building was the original Clinton's Ditch, the Erie Canal, and this went right through town until 1919, when thanks to steam-powered tugboats, etc., they were able to use the Clyde River as the Erie Canal. And so in about 1919 and shortly thereafter, this part of the Erie Canal was filled in. You see here the VFW. Before the VFW, there was a building that Ketchum's used as a storehouse for its fertilizer. And so now we enter the mill itself and see what it holds for us. And in this office space, and that's a key word here because initially the Ketchum and Malloy office was next to the coal bins. But when they moved into the use of this building as an office, it obviously was important, among us for other reasons, for the scale. And here, when the driver has brought his truck up to the scale, it could be weighed here. And a scale was very important. There were several mills in Clyde at this time, but very few scales. Okay, now this room is being used by the Historical Society for many exhibits, many of which are in the process of change. And then...
what would have been over on this part, Hugh?
Okay. You're going to help me a little bit. I just know that the sale of paint was here off to our left, which is now has a lot of our sports memorabilia.
Over here, we've been told would have been displays of various Purina products. Ketchum and Malloy, and then later Ketchum and Son was a Purina dealer, so they would have had displays of the latest and greatest in Purina products, from feeds and seeds to pesticides and other farm paraphernalia. And over here would have been more display cases of products by the door. Hugh, I will follow you in.
Okay. We are going to be looking at 3 floors of activity, and we're now on the other side of that deck where farmers would be pulling up, and we will briefly mention these items that you see here, but we will go into more detail near the end of our video.
So just briefly, this here is the mixer, in some sense the final stage. Lots of ground and added ingredients all mixed together and then bagged off. And this is the molasses blender. Could have added molasses to the things that were mixed.
And then the initial stage might be here.
Yes, Hugh, what are we looking at right here?
Here's where we perhaps bring in our corn that we want chopped, and we would pour it down here, and that would go down to the bottom or basement floor where that corn would be ground. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're heading next.
That's where we're heading next. So let's go.
Okay.
pass the camera off to you.
Yes. And now we're going to find out the process and how it began. Okay.
So outside I mentioned that there was that long building that had a conveyor belt inside of it. And this is where that belt would have gone. So one way that product could have entered, corn could have entered the mill, was through here. It could have been conveyed and then funneled down into this machine here, which is a cob blowing and corn sheller. So the whole dried cobs would have come in here, been shelled in this part of it. The cobs would have been blown up and discarded into a bin. And then the shelled corn would have been augured on this long screw over from the sheller over here to the elevator, which it's hard to see now, but there are cups in here, and this would have continuously run down here and up here all the way to the 3rd floor, which we'll see in just a moment. But yeah, the shelled corn would have been dropped off into here and taken up this way. And right next to the elevator is the grinder. And Hugh showed us up top where that hole in the ground with the grate over it is. That's where, oats, corn, wheat, anything you wanted ground would have been dumped in and dumped down into this machine. And the corn would have been, the corn or the oats would have been ground up in this machine. The texture would have been controlled by these screens. There's kind of a large one in here now, but you could have added a finer screen for a different animal or for a different consistency of feed. And then after it was all ground up, it would have been blown up this tube to the top floor, which we'll see in just a second. There's a fan right here, and it would have just been, or we think that it would have just been pure air pressure from this fan that would have blown the ground grain all the way up to the 3rd floor. And this here is the motor, the largest motor in the whole building, that would have powered up the grain. So powerful, we've heard stories that the lights would dim when they turned it on. It would draw so much power to get this thing up to speed. And over here we have the molasses heater. This pipe here connects up to the molasses blender upstairs.
Some of the molasses from a bigger tank was brought over to this tank here, especially in wintertime. The molasses would need to be heated so that it would be somewhat a fluid, and therefore could be added as one of the items being blended with the other grains. So molasses was an enjoyable, from an animal point of view, form of nutrition.
And where was the larger tank that we are no longer seeing?
Okay, the larger tank was here. I think it probably extended maybe from here all the way up to here. It was removed in 1990 and given away. And then at that point, what used to be a somewhat muddy basement floor, this was cemented. So the museum has been maintained in some very fine ways.
Okay, and so right here are some of the large wooden bins that would have held various types of grain that they could have brought down to be blended. But before we pay attention to those, let's come over here. All right, and right here, this is the pipe that connected to the grinder way down below. So the grain that was ground 30 feet below us would have been blown up into this cylinder up here. The air pressure would have been vented, and then it would have been dropped down, either diverted into a bin over here that was accessible from the main floor, or it would have dropped down into the mixer. And it's pretty dark, but it's hard to see. But this is how the grain that came up from the grinder would have gone down into the mixer. But that's the big kind of cone that you see in the main floor, where everything would have been mixed together. This is where the grain would have entered into that, and a motor up here would have actually done the mixing. So that's the mixer right there. And then right by the grinder that this chute is connected to was also the elevator. This is where we see on the third floor that grain that would have been elevated up at the bottom would have gone down this way and up this one all the way up to the top. And from there, the grain could have been diverted into one of several bins. And those bins are connected to chutes that are accessible from the main floor. So again, 30 feet below us, it's elevated up there and then diverted into one of several bins. And here, Hugh, I'll take the camera and show what one of those bins would have, could have looked like. So up there is the very top of the elevator, and then this chute would have taken it down and let the grain out into this one particular bin here. And they're covered up now, but you can see these are the holes in the bin that would have dropped down into chutes that would have let grain come out on the main floor. And I think now we want to go and see what things looked like on the main floor, Hugh, so we'll follow you.
All right.
Careful.
In this portion of the top floor, Benedict, what did we have chirping away here?
They had laying hens up here. They would sell eggs, not really as a commercial pursuit, but as a I don't know, a way to
a sideline,
a sideline thing, a way to get eggs to friends and family in the homestead. So yeah, we've had several people tell us about their memories of the chickens that used to be up here.
Okay, thank you.
And here in this room, as we enter the main floor again, would have been where just other bagged feed was, seed, pre-mixed Purina products. Some folks wouldn't have come in wanting to have their own feed ground. They just wanted to pick up a couple bags of, chicken or cow or hog feed, or they would want to have some of the pre-ground stuff or additives added to their own mix. That was also a possibility. And here's the dock that things would have come in and out of if they didn't come in on the sheller at the basement. So Hugh, why don't you explain to us what we're looking at right here?
Okay, and here we have another scale, obviously much smaller scale than we saw at the beginning. But when a farmer was buying his feed, it could be weighed here, and the charge would be decided on at that point. Benedict, could you talk to us about these wooden pipes, shall I say?
Yes. So these are the chutes that would have connected to those bins up at the top level. And you can see they kind of connect to different parts of the ceiling, corresponding to where the different bins were. Here's another one, here's another one right here. There's one, over in that corner as well. And these are the various chutes where different kinds of grain would have come out. You could have bagged it off. We have a bag off of this one. So if somebody came and say they just wanted, a few bags of whole oats, they could have, pulled it out of here. Alternatively, if they wanted, some kind of grain added to their own mix, they could have pulled off some in here and then brought it right over here to the chute for the grinder. So this is where it all kind of starts, where it all comes full circle. We're back to the beginning with the grinder. Corn could have been dumped down into this grate that we know takes it down into the grinder. And from the grinder, it would have been blown up this pipe here, up into the 3rd floor. So it continues right on through the main floor. And next to the grinder that we saw in the basement was the elevator. And these are the 2 shafts of the elevator right here. Here's where grain could have been added to the elevator from the main floor. And here we can see the cups that would have carried the grain up this shaft all the way to the top floor, and then they would have come down this one. So Hugh, remind us, what are we looking at right here?
Okay, here we're looking at the mixer. And when we were upstairs on the top floor, we were looking at a cone, as we called it, and that would have led to this fixture right here. And this is when we would be able to mix not only the grain, the major part of the grain, but anything that we wanted blended with it, whether it was another grain or it might be the molasses.
Or a vitamin or some other additive like that.
In fact, I might even point this out. We don't know to what extent this was used, but this Purina check mixer, they called it, would tell us what kinds of items we might put together in order to feed hogs, to feed cows, to feed geese, or turkeys, perhaps, and chickens. All right.
Okay, and those kinds of things could have been added straight into the mixer here, right at the bottom. So they could have added it straight in here, and that would have been mixed up with all the grain that had been brought in from the top. And then it could have been, here, do you want to, I'll pass the camera off to you. And from the mixer, after everything had been added to it, either vitamins in the bottom or various grains sent in from the top, they could have bagged it off right here, brought this thing down, spiked it on, bagged it off, and then that would have been a finished product. They could have brought it over to be weighed, and the farmer would have taken it back in their truck. Alternatively, if the farmer, say had most often cows, they would maybe want to have molasses added to it. So the molasses could have been, or the mixed feed could have been pumped up here into the molasses mixer. And this pipe here brought up the warmed molasses from the basement. There's a little thermometer right here. The grain brought over here and dropped into this part here where it would have been kind of mixed together. The molasses dropped down onto it and all mixed together, and then bagged off right here. And it was a continuous process, so they would have to go back and forth and continuously bag until all of the product was through the system. And that also would have been a finished product that they could have weighed off and let their farmer go with.
In order to run all this machinery, mills of the past needed to be near a waterfall. There was even a mill in Clyde where machinery was moved by horses walking around in a circle on a treadle. But obviously in the 1900s, we'd entered the age of electricity. And here you see the basic control panel of the mill that ran its various functions. In fact, Benedict, how would you name those functions?
So here, the most, powerful implement would have gone to that big motor in the basement that controlled the grinder. This is the one that drew so much power that the lights would dim whenever it was started. Here's the crank that would have got the grinder going, and then you would have pushed it forward to then engage it. So and you can see that there were some serious wires coming in and out of this. This was directing a lot of power into the basement of the mill. And next to it here, we have the mixer, the sheller, and the elevator, and some other unlabeled ones, but they all would have controlled the various devices throughout the mill. In order to keep tabs prior to the age of, the security camera, there were helpful ways to communicate with, whoever was working in the basement. See right down there is the motor for the grinder. And these little yelling holes exist throughout the mill to be able to control or to keep tabs and communicate about the various issues or goings on as things would arise. And here we see the A.R. Ketchum and Son sign that would have hung over the door. It wasn't always A.R. Ketchum and Son. It started off between a Mr. Malloy and Mr. Burke. So it was Burke and Malloy in about 1909. They started a feed and coal business on this area. Shortly after that, though, in 1910, my great-great-grandfather, Fred Ketchum, the Alfred of A.R. Ketchum, bought out Burke's share, and it became Ketchum and Malloy. And Ketchum and Malloy continued on until about 1943, when Dan Malloy died, and my great-grandfather, George Ketchum, bought out his share, and it was A.R. Ketchum and Son. And George operated under the moniker A.R. Ketchum and Son until 1973. Yeah. Okay.